So next up, without further ado, is Cindy Duff. She is our founder, and thank God for Cindy. If Cindy wasn't here, Compass would not exist. And because of Cindy, Compass exists. And because of Cindy, we are serving missionary families out there. So Cindy's going to be talking about depression and anxiety. They are themes that resonate throughout the Bible, reflecting the human experience of distress and despair. These narratives and teachings highlight the Bible's relevance in addressing mental health challenges, offering both solace and guidance for those facing depression and anxiety. So, without further ado, I want to present to you Cindy Duff and her workshop of depression and anxiety in the Bible.
Hello. So glad you've decided to join us here today for this online conference on faith and mental health. And today's workshop, I'm going to cover depression and anxiety, very important and common problems, and what the Bible has to say about both. Hi, I'm Cindy Duff, and the founder of Compass Ministries, located here in Tampa, Florida. We provide mental health care to missionaries and their children at no cost or low cost, providing a variety of services, including pastoral counseling, clinical counseling, coaching, debriefing, play therapy for young children. And so if you'd like to know more about us, you can go to compass-ministries.net and take a look at the services that we provide. But today we're going to talk about depression and anxiety. Now, depression is a very common mental illness in the United States, and it's characterized by a lack of motivation or energy, an inability to enjoy any experience. So when someone's depressed, if something good happens to them, they're not going to feel the enjoyment of that. Chronic negative thinking, constant feelings of sadness. Some people feel anger instead of sadness, and it needs to be continuous for more than 2 weeks in order to be diagnosed with clinical depression. 1 in 5 people will experience clinical depression in their lives, and many more will experience depressed mood because of losses and grief and other things happening in their life. So it's a very common experience to feel this emotion of depression. A lot of people want to know, well, what's the difference between grief and depression? And these two pictures really do a good job of illustrating it. Grief will be waves of sadness coming over you because of a loss. And then the wave might take a day or two to pass, and then you'll kind of go back to normal functioning for a while, and then the grief comes back and it washes over you again. So that is what grief is like. Now, depression is more like the picture on the right, where it's a constant state of lack of energy, lack of motivation, sadness, and so it's just constantly there. So that would be the difference between the depressive feelings a person feels when they're having grief and the depressive feelings someone has when they have a mental illness of depression. So how are the ways that God deals with our illness of depression? Well, divine healing is available, instantaneous healing from depression in that case. Sometimes God comes alongside us and supports us while we wait out the depression, because psychiatrists tell us it takes about 3 years to reset the brain. What happens in clinical depression, we think, is that the brain stops making the neurotransmitters that transmit happy mood. And it can take up to 3 years for the brain to reset and be able to make those neurotransmitters again. So it's an actual, we believe, a physical impairment in the brain that prevents us from experiencing happy mood. So sometimes God comes alongside us and supports us as we wait out the depression. It can take 2-3 years for that to happen. And then slowly we start to become ourselves again. Or a third way is that God has allowed us to discover medicines that will cure our depression, usually within 6 weeks. And there are several different classes of antidepressants. The thing about getting on the right antidepressant is we don't have any way, like with a blood test or anything like that, to find out what kind of medicine will work in a particular person's situation. And so in some ways, it's trial and error. There's 3 different types of antidepressants that work on establishing a higher level of serotonin, norepinephrine, and other neurotransmitters that are important for happy mood, to establish a reserve of those in our brain. And so there's a couple of different ways to do it. And sometimes, for instance, taking a serotonin selective uptake inhibitor will work for some people, and it prevents the reuptake of serotonin. So over time, bit by bit, the little bits of serotonin that are being made in the brain will eventually get to the point where we have enough to feel happy again. But sometimes those don't work with some people, and there are other antidepressants that instead stimulate the brain to actually make these neurotransmitters. So you go on an antidepressant. If it's going to work, it usually will work within 6 weeks. If it's not working, then your doctor may want to try a different medicine. But we do have a few medicines, antidepressants, that God has allowed us to discover to deal with this if it's to the level that it's an illness. In my life, I can give you a testimony that I've experienced 3 clinical depressions in my life. Depression can be genetically passed down, a predisposition for it. And I believe I do have that and the genetic history for depression. 3 times. Once in my 20s, once in my 30s, and once in my 40s. Now I'm considerably older than 40 now, and I've been depression-free now for many decades. But I did experience major depression 3 times. The first time, God healed me instantaneously in a prayer meeting. The second depression in my 30s, I went to a doctor about it, and he unwisely just basically told me I needed to buck up. Well, that was not very helpful, but I did just try to buck up, and it took me almost 3 years in order to come out of the depression. So he didn't really help me. The third time, I had learned about depression and antidepressant medications, and I went on medicine, and my depression lifted within just a few weeks. So I've experienced all 3 of these ways that God can intervene to heal, and I'm grateful for all 3 of them. So how do Christians tend to react when they are depressed? Well, often Christians feel guilty about being depressed. People might subtly or even not so subtly accuse them of having a lack of faith. If they would just trust God, then this would go away and they would be fine. And there's a lot of scripture that talks about us rejoicing in everything, being joyful in all times. And so when they get this illness and are unable to feel joyful, they feel guilty about that. But the truth is that many people in the Bible experience depression. And I think we can learn something about how God feels about depression by looking at one of these stories. And I thought we would look at the story of Elijah in 1 Kings 19. Now, if you remember the story, Elijah was a prophet. He came into the evil king Ahab and told him there would be no rain until they stopped worshiping Baal, and he prayed, and the rain stopped, and famine came to the land, and he was in hiding for 3 years. But then Elijah came out of hiding because God said it was time for the rains to come back. And he challenged the priests of Baal to a contest. And there were hundreds of the priests of Baal and only Elijah, the only prophet of God there. And he said, whichever God sent fire from heaven to consume the offering on the altar would be the true God, and Israel would need to follow that God. And so all Israel gathered around to watch this demonstration. And the priests of Baal went first, and they prayed all day and tried to get Baal to send down fire, and nothing happened. And then Elijah, water on top of his wood and his carcass and everything to make it obvious that it wasn't a trick by him. And then he just prayed one simple prayer. And God sent fire down from heaven and consumed the altar and the stones and the carcass and the wood and everything. And then all the prophets of Baal were put to death. And so we start in chapter 19 of 1 Kings. Now Ahab told Jezebel everything Elijah had done and how he had killed all the prophets of Baal. So Jezebel sent a messenger to Elijah saying, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of theirs. And Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. Now, I think it's remarkable that here's somebody of tremendous faith who prayed and it didn't rain for 3 years, who prayed again and God sent fire down from heaven, who stood up to 450 prophets of Baal all by himself. And yet the queen says, I'm going to kill you. And he's immediately afraid and runs away. These prophets, they're just like us. They are human, have frailties. And this was Elijah's. In fact, God says that he knows our frame. He remembers we're just dust. He has more compassion on us than we have on ourselves. Well, it goes on to say, when he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, and he went a day's journey into the desert. And he came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the tree and fell asleep. All at once, an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. And he looked around, and there by his head was a cake of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. And he ate and drank and then lay down again. And the angel of the Lord came a second time and said, get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. So he got up and ate and drank, and in the strength of that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Horeb, the mountain of God. And there he went into a cave and spent the night and waited for God. And so there he is for 40 days waiting for God to show up. And he expects God to show up in some dramatic way. And there was a fire and there was a wind that passed through the mountain, but God was not in any of those things. There was an earthquake. God still didn't show up. But every time God sent a sign, he said to Elijah, what are you doing? And every time Elijah says to God, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, broken down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword, and I alone am left. And now they're trying to kill me too. And so God sent these 3 signs, and for 3 times Elijah said this exact same thing to God. It tells me that Elijah was ruminating about these bad things that had happened. He's rehearsing it in his mind over and over and over and over, which is a characteristic of someone who's depressed. Well, if you remember, God listens to Elijah 3 times, and after the 3rd time, there was a still small voice. And Elijah came out, and God said to him, what are you doing here? And Elijah tells God all of the injustice and the horrible things that have happened. And God does not rebuke Elijah, all he does is say to him, there are still 7,000 who have not bowed the knee to Baal, so you're not alone. And I have a new job for you. I want you to go anoint a new king. Ahab's not going to be king much longer. And I want you to go anoint a new prophet, because you need to disciple somebody to take your place when you are dead. And so Elijah goes and does those things, and he comes out of this depression that he was in. So I think it's important for us to notice how God reacts to Elijah. First of all, he didn't rebuke Elijah. We are so commonly prone to rebuking people who are struggling with depression, but God doesn't. He does not rebuke him. God sends an angel to care for him physically. He needed rest. God waited 40 days so that Elijah would have to rest until his new assignment came about. God listens patiently to his complaint 3 times. God challenges the inaccuracies in the way Elijah is interpreting his situation. And then God gave him something new to do that was meaningful. And I hope that the way that God reacts to him gives you some hope and some grace that you can give yourself if you have suffered from depression. So I think it's important. What we can learn from Elijah is we should never be afraid to tell God exactly how we feel. Rumination can cause us to focus on inaccurate or harmful interpretations of what's going on. And I think it's important that we be quiet and stop ruminating, stop these thoughts going round and round and round, and instead ask God to give us a new interpretation of what's happening. What is God doing in this situation? What's his plan? And I think if we are quiet and read his word and consult with other believers and listen, that God will give us a new, less, more hopeful interpretation of what's going on. If we focus on the truth about our life, that God is with us, that he cares about us, that he is sovereign, this will lead us toward healing. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is rest. Elijah running away to the desert, retreat under the broom tree, was what needed to happen in that moment. God understands our emotional weaknesses and our physical weakness, and he doesn't condemn us. And a new direction can help us develop a new perspective. So, depression is something that we don't need to feel guilty for. Rest and changing our negative thinking and focusing on what God's at work doing can help us deal with losses and discouragement before it develops into a clinical illness, depression. But sometimes, in spite of all these efforts of dealing with negative things with faith and with optimism, and in spite of all those efforts, in spite of rest and good nutrition, we can still develop hopelessness and illness of clinical depression. So if hopelessness and low energy and sadness continues continuously, not up and down, but continuously for more than 2 weeks, then know that an illness has started and that you're going to see a doctor and may need medicines in order to deal with it. Now, another mental illness that the Bible talks about and that is very, very common in the United States is anxiety. In fact, clinical depression is the most common mental illness. But if you take the anxiety disorders, there's a variety of anxiety disorders together. It's the most common category of mental illness in the United States. 1 in 3 Americans will suffer from an anxiety disorder sometime in their lifetime. Fear and anxiety is actually something that God gave us. It's helpful because it keeps us safe from dangers. If we didn't have any fear, then we wouldn't stay away from dangerous situations. But an anxiety disorder is not about safety. Anxiety disorders are about out of control anxiety. Now, the causes of anxiety disorders, there is a very strong genetic component to anxiety disorders. It definitely runs in families. And there are two feedback loops in the body that can trigger the amygdala. And the amygdala is part of the limbic system at the center, the core of the brain, that triggers feelings of fear and anxiety in order to get us to activate the fight-flight cascade of reactions in the body so that we have adrenaline to fight off danger and we are more tuned in and alert. So the amygdala is a good thing. It's something God has put in our body. But there are two feedback loops that can trigger the amygdala when there isn't really any danger. The first is if your body's muscles are tense. The amygdala pays attention to your bodily muscles. If they're tense for a long time, then the amygdala will fire. And sometimes this can trigger panic attack or some other anxiety. Another feedback loop that the amygdala is wired into is the prefrontal cortex. And if we're thinking about worry or danger or concerns for the future, the amygdala will fire because we are running all kinds of dangerous scenarios through our mind in our rumination. So two effective ways of controlling high anxiety are progressive muscle relaxation sessions daily, so that your tenseness in your muscles doesn't build up, but that each day you can get them to relax and start fresh the next day. And if you don't know how to do progressive muscle relaxation, there are scripts online. You can Google progressive muscle relaxation and just follow the instructions to tighten and then relax different muscle groups in your body as you go systematically through the body while doing some deep breathing. Another way is to replace this rumination, constantly thinking about worries about the future, and instead replace these with hopeful, positive thoughts. Trust in the Lord. However, there are some people who are predisposed to anxiety. Their amygdala is overactive, and these ways of controlling anxiety are not enough. And I do not want you to take this seminar if you're one of those people that has an overactive amygdala and nothing that you're doing can stop it. I don't want you to take from this seminar that somehow you're failing in your ability to control it. That's an illness and needs medical attention. But for run-of-the-mill anxiety that most of us have, these are two ways that can really reduce the amount of anxiety that we have. So what does the Bible say about anxiety? Well, Jesus tells us not to worry or fear, instead to trust God. And that is found in Luke 12. And he also says that anxiety saps our energy and solves nothing. He says, who of you, by worrying about life, can add a single hair to your head? So he says it does not help. I think it's interesting that every time the Lord or an angel appears to someone, the first thing they say is, fear not. Fear is a normal emotion that God expects from us, and we are not to, denigrate ourselves because we're fearful. Fearful is normal, and like I said before, is something God gave us to keep us safe. But if we are dealing with anxiety due to worry, something like that, I think Philippians 4 gives us a road map to peace. In fact, it says the peace of God, which transcends all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds if you do these things. So let's take a look at what Philippians 4 says we're to do. Rejoice in the Lord always. Again, I say rejoice. Obviously, cultivating a habit of gratitude and joy in your life, noticing the blessings that God has put in your life. In our resilience seminar, we talk about this and developing a gratitude journal. because positivity gives us resilience to come back from difficulties. So first, work on that positivity. Then it says, rejoice. Let your gentleness be evident to all, for the Lord is near. Remember, the Lord is near. You're not alone. He is with you no matter what you're facing. And that can give you peace. Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving. Present your requests to God, and the peace of God will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus. So pray about everything instead of worrying. Develop a habit of thanksgiving. Maybe start a gratitude journal. And then he goes on and he says something quite interesting, and he does a play on words here. He says, finally, brothers, whatever's true, noble, right, pure, lovely, admirable, excellent, praiseworthy, think on these things, and whatever you have learned or received in me, put it into practice, and the God of peace will be with you. I really love that, because I would rather have the God of peace with me than the peace of God with me. And I think it's interesting how he does that play on words. He says the God of peace will be with us if we do two things. If we disciplined our mind to think about things that are true. Think about the last thing you worried about. Is it true in your life, or is it just something you're worried is going to happen? If it hasn't happened yet, then it's not true. I remember counseling a woman once who was so worried because her husband was self-employed and he wasn't getting as many jobs as he used to, and she was worried that they were going to starve. And I said to her, well, do you have enough money to pay your bills this month? Oh, yes, we have enough. Okay, so God has provided for this month. You need to focus on the truth of right now that God has provided and trust him for the future. So focus on what is true. As a young bride, I used to worry because my husband traveled a lot for his work. And I used to worry that he was going to die in a plane crash or something. But then I had to start saying to me, okay, is that true? No, that's not true. My husband is in good health and fine. So let's focus on what is true in my life. Same thing, honorable things. Sometimes we look at the news and we see so much dishonorable things happening, and we ruminate on those things over and over and over. But let's focus on what's honorable in the world. Let's focus on the good things that are happening in the world, what is just, instead of focusing on injustice all the time. Let's focus on what's pure instead of impurity. By doing these things, disciplining our minds in these ways, we will experience the presence of God and his peace in our life, the peace of God and the God of peace. Also, it's important for us to look at people who live a life of peace and calmness and faith and model our lives after these people. And that will help us to experience the peace of God and the God of peace in our lives. Now, as I mentioned before, some people do have a naturally overactive amygdala, and this is an actual illness. Muscle relaxation, controlling your thoughts will not work in such cases, at least not very much. It may take the anxiety down from up here to here, but it's still going to cause problems. And so these people may need occasional anxiolytics to tamp down the anxiety. However, it's important to know, and I'm sure that your doctor will tell you this, that unlike antidepressants, anxiolytics are addictive. And to stop taking them is difficult. Side effects are insomnia, other problems. But if you cannot function because your anxiety is so high, and none of these other ways of addressing the anxiety are making it so that you can function effectively, then there's no shame in taking a medicine to correct a defective body part, in this case, the amygdala. Especially if these non-pharmacological treatments are not working. So I hope it helps to know that some people have an illness, and that we don't add onto the suffering that they already have with anxiety, condemnation, and telling them that their faith is not adequate or something like that. I remember one of my professors when I was training to be a counselor. He was a psychologist, and he was also a pastor of a large church. And his wife went through a postpartum depression where she couldn't get any relief. In fact, it was such a bad depression that she started to have psychotic thoughts, delusions, and um, other thoughts that did not jive with reality. And people kept coming up to her and saying, well, if you just pray more, if you just read your Bible more, God would heal you. And at the time, he wasn't a psychologist, he was just a pastor. And he thought, I know my wife is a deeply spiritual woman. She is praying and in the word more than any of these people that are condemning her for having this illness. There's got to be a better way to help Christians who are dealing with something like this. And that's when he decided to go back and he got his PhD in psychology and became a psychologist and became my professor and taught me how to help people. So, by the way, his wife did get better after a few months from this depression, but he was able to find a doctor who could help her. We don't want to add to people's suffering by adding condemnation that somehow their faith is inadequate, or give them simplistic answers that, well, if you just do this box breathing technique, that the anxiety will go away. For some people, it will, but for some people who really have an illness, it will not. And so we need to show compassion to people who are struggling with either depression or anxiety, the common problems of humanity we deal with. Okay. So just want to end with this thought. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of compassion and the God of all comfort, who comforts us in our troubles, so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves receive from God. For just as we share abundantly in the sufferings of Christ, so also our comfort abounds through Christ. So keep that in mind, that Christ not only helps us, but he also shows us how to share our comfort with others. So this concludes a very short and superficial, in some ways, overview of what the Bible has to say about depression and anxiety. And I hope what you see from this, that it's true, that God really does know our frame, and he remembers that we're just dust, and he shows compassion and grace to us in our times of illness and suffering. And sometimes these feelings of anxiety or depression are short-lived, and we can deal with them using some of these strategies that are known to work pretty well. But some people actually have a defective organ, an amygdala, or the neurotransmitters of their brain are not working properly, and so are prone to these mental illnesses. And we need to be careful that we don't condemn them for reaching out to the medical community for the resources that God has allowed us to discover that will help them with this illness. If somebody was diabetic and they were no longer producing insulin, I don't think you would shame them for taking insulin, right, to deal with their diabetes. In the same way, someone who has clinical depression and needs medical intervention, it should not be shamed, and we need to show compassion and support to them and give them comfort, the comfort that God has given us in times, and encourage them to see a doctor if they are suffering from a mental illness. Well, thanks so much for joining with us here. at Compass Ministries for our seminar on mental illness and faith. And I hope this has been helpful to you. There are several other seminars that are happening today. I hope you'll tune into them. They'll also be available on tape on our Facebook page and our website later after Giving Tuesday is over. We are here to help missionaries and their family to bear up under the stresses that they endure in cross-cultural ministry. And we do our very best to keep those costs very, very low. We fundraise in order to cover our overhead costs in order to provide for these services. And if you are someone who's committed to finishing the Great Commission in this generation, and you know how hard it is to go to the last remaining unreached people groups, if you would like to help provide these services to missionaries who are going to some of the least reached people in the world and some of the hardest places to reach people for Christ, if you want to provide them the services and support that we give, then I think we are a good place for you to invest some of your giving to the Lord through Compass Ministries. So thank you again for listening and being a part of our event today. Lord, go with you, give you peace. Amen.
Thank you, Cindy Duff. Cindy is the founder of Compass Ministries, and I really, really appreciate her. She has been also my mentor over the years, and she is just full of wisdom. Cindy started Compass Ministries in 2011, actually, when she was working with Missionary Homes D&D. And then she incorporated Compass Ministries in 2012, and she has been serving single-handedly missionaries since 2012. And then slowly but surely, a team formed around her, including myself. And today, we are a team of counselors and coaches and support services to help missionaries and their families. Thank you, Cindy, for speaking about depression and anxiety. It's interesting because I myself have suffered from anxiety and depression over the years, especially when I went to the mission field. For 8 years, my wife and I were in Colombia, South America. Just so you all know my story, how I ended up in Compass Ministries, and I didn't really know anything about reverse culture shock, disorientation, or the effects of cross-cultural ministry and coming back home to the United States on my mental health. Um, it wasn't even in my radar. Most missionaries, when when we get called by the Lord to go overseas, there's an excitement. With me, it's we I was so focused, just wanting to serve the Lord. I was focused on going overseas. And in fact, in my mind is I'm gonna die overseas serving the Lord, And the worst thing that can happen, I always say this, the worst thing that can happen to a missionary is actually they don't die overseas and they come back home. And there's life after the mission field. And what do you do after, right? So it impacted me. I went through a depression for about 6 months, didn't know what was going on with me. It was very uh, gut-wrenching, very disorientating. I was overwhelmed when I used to go to Walmart. When I would gas up a car, all of a sudden I was disorientated. I didn't know where to put my credit card, and it's embarrassing, and unknowingly I felt embarrassed by that, and there was a lot of shame. And I thank God for Compass Ministries for being there and for putting defining or putting the words and uh, putting the name to what I was going through. And that's half the battle when you can actually define what you're going through and to understand that, hey, this is, you're not going crazy. This is a normal reaction of your body and your brain to an abnormal situation. And so there's so many of us, so many missionaries out there. So I wanted, my heart and why we're doing this today is to actually reach out to the churches, reach out to the pastors to understand what your missionaries go through. When you send them overseas, there are certain things, mental health wise, spiritually, emotionally, that happens. It's not that, a lot of times we chuck it to, what Angie and Amanda talked about, lack of faith or a weak faith, or because they are wounded missionaries or prior to going there, or they're ill-equipped. They're also just human beings, and when they're humans, you can only subject them to so much trauma and abnormal situations before their body normally would react to it. So to destigmatize mental health issues, mental illness, mental health disorders, would actually benefit the church more. As Cindy had, and all of our speakers today had advocating for um, destigmatizing mental health and to um, uh, normalize it in our church so that people don't become embarrassed or shamed about what they're going through, and they can seek the help that they need. Um, so the best thing that ever happened to me really was Compass Ministries and just the support that they've given us, my wife and I. Cindy has been very instrumental in when she mentored me. And actually, she didn't realize this, but healing my heart. And that's why I started volunteering for Compass and eventually working for Compass. Um, Today, one of the joys that every day that I have is helping missionary families. My most favorite thing to do in Compass is debriefing missionaries when they're coming back home. It always touches my heart. Um, it inspires me, encourages me, because no matter how hard their lives have been and what they have gone through, um, their faith and their resolve to worship God and to serve God and to live for God uh, doesn't diminish. They have sat in front of me, have cried, and uh, spent a day in sorrow, sharing their stories, but their resolve to love the people that God put in their lives overseas and here locally in the United States, never diminished. And so it's inspiring. It's very encouraging. So I want to encourage you all, if you want to make truly an impact to the world, um, uh, I would like to encourage you all to help support Compass Ministries in helping missionaries become healthy, be healthy, and become healthy in the field and coming back home. One of the things that we do in Compass that a lot of other organizations don't do is we serve the missionaries for life, even when they come back home. The hardest thing for missionaries is not actually going overseas to the field. The hardest thing for missionary families is coming back home. When they come back home, um, there's a reverse culture shock that happens. There's a culture shock that happens with third culture kids, and you're gonna learn that with Carrie and Dressler when she talks about third culture kids. But the transition that happens is it's brutal sometimes, and coming back home is very difficult. So one of the things that Compass Ministries does is to help transition back home missionary families, and we stay with them, and it doesn't matter if it's 10 years, 20 years down the road. We help them not only to acclimate but to help them resolve some of their issues from overseas, help them normalize here, and all that. And you have missionary kids. Let's just be candid. And during the 50s, 60s, so the last 100 years, missionary kids in the past, they suffered a lot, and they've been, they back then you have to go into a boarding school. It's not so much today, but there's reasons for that, and families, parents, missionary parents were obligated to put their children in boarding schools way back when, and for safety, for their own safety. Uh, but it made an impact on those missionary kids, and those missionary kids that were in boarding schools back then in the 50s and the 60s and the 70s are now they're in their 50s, they're in their 60s, they're in their 70s, and a lot of their issues as missionary kids hasn't been touched. So we've been experiencing here in Compass uh, um, missionary kids that are now 50 years old, 60 years old, asking for help. Usually missionary kids after 30 years old is when they realize a lot of their issues are impacting them. Issues from transition and from overseas. Today, missionary care for MKs or TCKs are a lot more advanced, and there's a lot of preventative measures now that are being implemented. So a lot of our missionary kids today are healthier. But what Compass does is we never forget. We never forget those who have served overseas, those who have given their lives for the gospel, and we honor them by being here for them. And so if you if I just want to appeal to your hearts. I know your resources and time and finances are very limited, and we just ask you to consider in your giving Compass Ministries. If you want to leverage the impact in the world, then we ask you to donate to Compass Ministries that helps those who are in the front line that are impacting the world today. And more recently, I've been debriefing and counseling a bunch of missionaries, and one of the things, Cindy was talking about depression and anxiety. One of the things that produce depression and anxiety is foremost of all anxiety and stress. um, is situations, being overworked in situations that are very traumatic, that are difficult and challenging. And so, and this anxiety after a while becomes depression. And so one of the things that happens to missionaries is burnout. And there are a lot of good missionaries that have burnt out. And thank goodness for missionary care organizations like Compass Ministries, and there's others out there that are helping these missionaries recover from burnout and thrive and become productive, and still become productive in the field and at home.